For our last session today, the last panel session, actually, we are very happy to have 3 speakers here with me. I'm sitting here alone, but the 3 speakers are joining us from out of their own places, so they will join remotely. So we will follow the same format as we did during the other panel. Every speaker will have 15 minutes for the presentation. Afterwards, you can ask questions just by raising your hands. And for the people at home, they can raise or they can ask their questions in the chat during the presentations. And afterwards, if you have time, we will ask them to the speakers, but at the end of the session, we will have 20 minutes time for an in-depth discussion with all the panelists. So without further ado, I want to introduce to you the first speaker of today, being Professor Dr. Ian Milligan from the Waterloo University. He's not only a professor there, but he's also the Associate Vice President there. And his primary research topic is on how historians can use web archives, as well as the impact of digital sources on the practices more generally. And also since 2017, Ian Milligan has been the principal investigator of the Archives Unleashed project, and this is also his topic for the presentation today. So, Ian, the floor is yours.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you all from Canada. Wish I could be there in person with you all. So good morning from here and good afternoon to everybody. So today what I want to talk about is how we at the Archives Unleashed project, and I'm presenting on behalf of a much larger team, both at the University of Waterloo, at York University, and the Internet Archive, have tried to enable researchers to work with archived web sources. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And why we're interested in this is that we really understand the web to be a reflection of society. So we're interested in enabling historians and other scholars to be able to study the web, not just to understand the history of the web, but really to understand the broader context of, society as reflected on the web. We believe that, while the web has been critical, it's been archived since the middle of the 1990s, it's led to an abundance of material that people could use for political topics, economic topics, social topics, cultural topics. It really remains an untapped resource for research. And that, as we'll talk about, is that it is basically too hard to use these kinds of resources. And so we believe that researchers are going to need to use the web and social media, which I'll talk about in a second, if they're really going to rise to the challenge of doing this kind of work. Next slide, please. And so what we've seen as a challenge is that, well, hopefully you agree, and you're all at this conference today, you agree that social media and the web are important objects of study, is that realistically, when it comes time to use social media at scale, when it comes time to use the web at scale, that the available analytics tools, the available community infrastructure, and in some cases, the inaccessibility of web archival interfaces mean that there's a very, very high barrier if you want to conduct research with web archives at scale. In other words, the startup costs of getting into this field are extremely high. You can't just casually come into this and study it like you might many other kinds of historical sources, because you have to learn so much to do it. So next slide, please. And so for the link to social media, I'll just clarify that when I talk about the tools that we at the Archives Unleashed project have been working on to rise to these challenges, we're primarily talking about social media data, for example, that's being collected in web archives, collected by the Internet Archive, collected by a national library, stored in an ARC or a work format, as opposed to the data that comes in via an API. So I'm going to show you some tools and approaches we've taken. Just to put that as the framing context, this is all about web archives, which contain social media and is not the sort of the JSON data or something you might get directly from a social media provider via an API. So on the next slide, which I'll ask you to move forward to, I'll talk a little bit about the history of the Archives Unleashed project. So next slide, please. So as was mentioned in the gracious introduction, we started the Archives Unleashed project in 2017. And between 2017 and 2020, we developed an interface, which you can see at right, called the Archives Unleashed Cloud. And so we wanted to rise to those problems I began our presentation with and let researchers go in, sync their Archive-It collections, which is a subscription service the Internet Archive provides, analyze them, generate scholarly derivatives, and work with them. And we see the Archives Unleashed Cloud as really a standalone system that showed how, in theory, you could do this. You could make a web browser interface that let you work with web archives at scale. Next slide, please. And we also developed something called the Archives Unleashed Toolkit, which was an Apache Spark library. Here you could see our cutting-edge user interface, very user-friendly at right, a way to work with WARC and ARC files and analyze them. And we thought that, maybe if we created really good documentations, we would get researchers to use the command line to be able to analyze these files themselves. We were wrong. Nobody wants to use the command line. But at the end of this project, we had a really robust, we had a proof of concept that you could use a web interface to work with data. And in the back end, we had a pretty robust system for analyzing these web archives. Next slide, please. And so in 2020, we've started what we call, Archives Unleashed 2, which first of all was to merge Archives Unleashed with the Internet Archive so that people could use the Internet Archive to collect their web archives and then to study web archives. And ideally that researchers could use the interface to study other kinds of data that the Internet Archive has been collected with. So we've developed something called ARCH, the Archives Research Compute Hub, which I'll be talking about in depth in a second. And then we also foster and support a research community of practice. So we funded 5 teams in the first round. Frederic Claver was part of one of the teams. I know you heard from him earlier today. We have 5 new teams as well. And just trying to sort of get researchers working with these tools so that A, they can publish, and then other people want to work in this field, and B, they can see, we can see what they can do with our platforms and projects. So next slide, please. So the main goal of what we've been doing is developing this Archives Research Compute Hub, or ARCH, which is living at the Internet Archive. It's currently in beta, but there was just a tweet, you can see I retweeted it, where they're beginning to look for beta testers out there. And we have, and I see there's some good posts in the chat that can refer you to this, and have been working on developing a scalable analysis platform within the Archive-It environment, which lets a users dive into the data within web archival collections for further research. Next slide, please. Some of the features, if those in the room who've used Archive-It, the goal is that it looks familiar to an Archive-It user, that it's seamless, the same interface you're using to curate your collection, you're actually using to analyze the collection, that it addresses the first steps in analysis. We can't do everything in this interface. Researchers might still need to have notebooks or interfaces to work with their data, but the first part of it can be done here. And it can be done by letting a user generate and download over a dozen different data sets, which I'll show you some examples in a second. Can work with in-browser visualizations and data previews to get a glimpse into collection content. And then crucially, because we have a dedicated, it's like half of a petabox, sitting in the Internet Archive data center, we have quick access to the data that's being collected. One of our previous problems was we had so many, if you ran your infrastructure somewhere else, you're spending most of your time sending petabytes or terabytes of data over the internet rather than analyzing it. So it's all in the same place, and that's really, really helpful as well. Next slide, please. And so hopefully this video will play. Maybe if we click again. Oh, the video is not playing. Maybe I can. Let's see if the video, oh, there's the video. So here is Arch in action. So here I am logging in to my Archive-It account, which is enabled. And here you see a list of all the collections that I have access to. Some of these are my own web archive collections. Many of them are social media heavy. Others are ones that other people have collected and given me access. So here I am looking at #MeToo. And I've decided I want to go in and generate some data sets. Here are the kinds of data sets I can generate from this collection. So I've decided to generate some network data. I'm generating some information on the Word documents that might have been found or collected as part of that. And then here you can see those are those jobs running. They go actually quite quickly because we have so much dedicated infrastructure. And in about 2 minutes, I'll get an email telling me that these data sets are available. But here's, for example, I can look what is being collected by this collection. You can go in and see, what kinds of information was collected in the crawl. And then I can actually even download that data if, say, I wanted to use it in a computational workflow. Similarly, here's the graph. Here are all the domains that we collected in this, and let's see how they relate to each other. Here we are, we're looking in, I can zoom in and out, getting a sense of, what are the central hubs, what are the main things. I can take a screenshot if I want to share with someone. Crucially though, there's the data set you see in front of you. I could load that into software like Gephi, for example, and see, run all that network analysis things to move us forward. And then I accidentally go one step too forward, it will come back. So here I'll go to another collection. This is a little web crawl, very tiny one, just of our own team web pages. I like it just because it's a smaller one. So again, I can look at data sets, see what people have been collected. Here I could say if I've collected more data, I'm rerunning that job. So actually you can see it's in a queue now. Just as a user, I know I've got to wait a little bit longer because there's currently, the system is at capacity. And I could just sort of explore this interface further. So that's really the quick snapshot of where we're at. So next slide, please. Oh, next slide after this video. Perfect. So I want to talk about in the last section of this is just how we've built something like that in case it's useful to other people in the room who are interested in moving towards developing an infrastructure platform that might be useful to your user communities. So next slide, please. When it came to developing this, because we have some experience, we've been doing this since 2017, and we work with the Internet Archive, which has a lot of experience with bringing products to market. We really wanted to sit down and be very deliberate about the kind of research tools that we created. So we spent a lot of time sitting down and, ideating, if I want to use a keyword, of, looking at what do we offer, what does ArchiveIt offer, what do other people offer, and what are the overlaps and the differences. And then unlike previous projects, we really set ourselves to, using a lot of pen and paper and then whiteboards once we were able to safely come back into our offices, sketching out wireframe interfaces. And then we did a lot of work of making storyboards. They were mock interfaces you could click through and it seemed like you're on a website, but it was like a Potemkin village. There was actually nothing behind any of the things you clicked on, but it was really a way for us to let our team and expanded team members play with their interface without us having any code. It was just a sort of example of how we do that. Next slide, please. And then, of course, we did quite a bit of user experience testing. So we've actually done 5 rounds of UX testing, and we realized we needed to be very conscious about working with researchers and understanding their user journey. This wasn't research. We were doing it for quality assurance purposes, so we can't really publish on the details of this. But, we really wanted to find out what do researchers need, what works well, what challenges do they hit, and when they use their interface, what needs aren't being met. So you can see with that graphic at right, we started off with interviews with power users. We then did internal testing with our colleagues at ArchiveIt and other engineers. We then moved out to sort of more power users, advisory board people. And then starting in 2022, we've been expanding it. And eventually we're, inviting 100+ people at a time, hoping that maybe if a bunch of people launch something at the same time, they'll find some way to break it. Because it's better to break in beta testing than it is in live. And of course, throughout working with these cohort teams, which we've funded. So we're really trying to be deliberate about what we do. So when we spend all this time and money and resources, it's a tool that actually works for the needs of our researchers. Next slide, please. This might be useful for folks in the room as they think about developing their own tools and approaches and platforms. That we really did see in the people that wanted to use, social media and web archive data, a real range of confidence, for example, that we have data scientist users who are very confident in their ability to analyze data and collectors are way less confident. So it was really tricky to find a way that keeps a data scientist engaged and also keeps, a casual researcher in this field engaged. That a number one thing was people like better integration into their analysis pipelines. They want quick downloads. So if they're using a Jupyter Notebook environment, you can bring your data in really, really quickly. They always ask us for more data sets, and that's really useful to find. We had 2 teams that actually working with us And they said, actually, all of this data is great, but we want to look at the JavaScript. We want to look at the raw HTML code. That was great to know. And so we were able to do that. Making sure that always things are accessible, not just for those who need accessibility features, but accessibility features make everything better for everybody. Improved workflow navigation and documentation is a constant challenge. Next slide, please. So we're doing a lot of work on front-end development, a lot of work connecting the fun GUI you saw with the command line, you know, the chunky interface in the background. And I'm not going to go into the sort of technical weeds, but we have lots of cool moving parts of this. Scalatra is the sort of front-end development. Spark does all the parallelization and distribution, which is really cool. The data is loaded into the HDFS system. We use a record loader called Sparkling, which you can check out on the Internet Archive's GitHub repository. We found that to be a really robust way to load ARCs and works, and Helga Holzman was the main lead on that. And of course, the Archives Unleashed toolkit. Next slide, please. So in my last minute, I'll just say, you know, we're still in beta. We have pilot users, but we're monitoring. And then in this last year, which we're now part of, really trying to think about how we can provide thoughtful access and use for non-Archivit subscribers and working around pre-filtering. So letting people narrow down collections, like say an IAPC collection of 10, 15 terabytes. How can they narrow that down so they're just working with a thoughtful subset? Next slide, please. Oh, next slide, please. So next slide as well. So just a few quick lessons learned. Sorry, next slide, please. In my last 10 seconds, if you build it, they don't come. You need to actively work to create an environment where users are feeling comfortable. You have to work to meet their needs. Won't make everybody happy, but you need to listen and be responsive. And you always need to be ready for the unexpected. Next slide, please. And so with my minus 10 seconds left, I'll just thank my institutional support, Archivit. Primarily all of this work has been supported by the Mellon Foundation and a host of other people. So with the next slide, please. With that, I'll say thank you very much and looking forward to any questions you might have now, and then looking forward to our panel discussion shortly. So thank you.
I think we will move now to the next presenter for today. I'm happy to turn over the stage to Dr. Louise-Amélie COUGNON. She leads actually the research team at the MEEL, UC Louvain lab dedicated to media innovation and intelligibility, where she also conducts an important project of digital corpora monitoring. So I will turn the stage over to her. I don't know if she's already...
I am.
She is here? Okay, but...
Can you hear me well yet?
We can hear you, but we cannot see you yet. Okay, we can see you. Okay.
Okay, hi everyone. So thank you. I'm thrilled to be here today with you, and I would like to thank the organizers for the invitation. In my presentation, I will discuss the implications of social media in research in linguistics and communication. So two research areas that often aim to advance community action, what I call community action, which means that this research often offers an added value for political, educational, associative, or even health-related decisions. Next slide, please. First, I will present the various kinds of digital corpora that we have been collecting since 2007, I think. I will briefly outline the sampling issues that were the focus of our attention during their collection. I will show how the Twitter archive presented this morning by the Be Social project has already served community action. And finally, I will present the ongoing image corpus that we are collecting before briefly concluding. Next slide, please. So first, a quick word about the MEEL, where I coordinate research projects. So the MEEL is a technological platform of the University UC Louvain, and its role within the university is being a service to society. And my role within the MEEL is to connect research and service to society. So our research projects are therefore very often connected to development or to re-injection into concrete actions, hand in hand with the actors of society. And we try most of the time to answer these questions. So how can research lead to answers for a sustainable society, answers for a better organized society, for an engaged, responsible, fair, and reliable society? Next slide, please. At the mill, we are currently collecting Belgian, both French and Dutch-speaking Norwegian and French from France data. Our aim is to extend the data to cover all the European Union, at least, and associated countries. The data is of three types: public content, that's what we call one-to-many; private content, these are electronic messages sent to one person or few people, group of people we have chosen; and finally, image-centered content. So since 2007, more or less, at first we have been collecting text messages, messenger content, and WhatsApp private messages. This has enabled us to follow individuals in various aspects of their life and behavior. We have studied spelling evolution, multi-skill writing, language trouble identification. Then we started to collect public data. So that was Twitter, but also Reddit, Twitch corpora, only comments above Twitch videos. And recently, we added the collection of image-centered publications, mainly from Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, but also associated images on Twitter. And I'm going to talk a little bit about everything today. Next slide, please. So to start with the research on social media, one-to-many. Next slide, please. This project initially stems from a desire, together with the Santal from the Be Social project this morning, to collect tweets that would be sufficiently representative to offer societal trends to various actors. So to scientists, of course, but also to the media, to agencies, to non-profit organizations. And so how did we imagine this plan at the first place? Well, we turned to Twitter because, as we said it several times today, it is the most accessible social media. Its content is often public and there are numerous APIs available. So harvesting tweets was not a technical challenge for us. The challenge is rather that Twitter's users constitute a very narrow proportion of the population, mostly journalists, politicians, or activists, whereas we are searching for citizens' account, the population accounts, and diverse population. And the challenge for each country was also to discover the citizen geographical tag that rarely appears in their profile information. So if you want to know more about the technical aspect of this collection or the sampling aspect of this population, please refer to this paper, because I'm not going to go into details right now about this. It's an open access paper. Next slide, please. So we partially succeeded to achieve a sample of each region's population. I say partially because it is an open corpus at first. We are still collecting the data. New accounts constantly appear and have to be filtered. Some accounts shut down and have to be retrieved. So it is an ongoing archiving process which has to be updated at least once a year. We decided once a year for this project. And apart from the population tweets, we are also collecting data from the media and the politicians, which present even more updating challenges. We have been talking a lot about challenges today, but more challenges. So at first, some politicians' accounts are closed and need to be replaced, of course, but more often in our in our corpus, do local politicians of one day become civilians the next day when election periods are closed. We therefore constantly have to monitor these lists of elected people, retrieve some and add new candidates. The media also represents a big challenge for us. Once we have the main 10 to 50 big names, written radio and TV media names for each geographical area. We wonder how to succeed in defining what is a media today, or what is a media for tomorrow. Do you include independent journalists in this list, or independent media? Do you even include media blogs or media channels? So these are the questions that we have to face in our everyday job. Next slide, please. So with this data, we have been able to achieve very different kinds of research, and I will present here several projects, mainly 2 projects. The Opinio project is the first one. The aim of the Opinio project was to develop a tool for journalists during TV shows that would enable to crawl the Twitter corpus and propose trends that would supplement traditional surveys and opinion polls among the population. So this tool was and is still used in various shows at the Belgian À Votre Avis TV show that you can see here. The tool gives clues about a lot of different things, like what do people talk about today or through the years, what kind of information do they share. Here, for example, you have the evolution per year of number of tweets written by the population about wealth tax in Belgium. Next slide, please. Here you have the number of tweets about the purchasing power written by Belgian politicians per party. And this constitutes the basis for conversations and interviews during TV shows. Next slides, please. At last, we can also extract the vocabulary associated with specific themes. We have seen word clouds today. Here is one more. And it's an example of the vocabulary associated with the Catholic Church, which we represented as a word cloud during one particular TV show this year. Next slide, please. So apart from the Opinio project, we also use this corpus for other scientific projects, among which a European project called 202CM, not the easiest name, that aims at defining skepticism, denial, and disagreement strategies that constitute disincentives to climate change mitigation. And the Twitter corpus can serve different purposes in this project. First, for example, we study who are the most engaged people and the most engaged political parties about climate change mitigation. Next slide, please. In the tweets, we also identify the signs of resistance and difficulties concerning climate change mitigation behaviors. We compare politicians' vocabulary to the population's one, and we highlight some mismatch between the resistance mentioned by the population and answers evoked by politicians. We have seen, for example, that this mismatch of vocabulary has led to misunderstanding and even rejection. Next slide, please. Finally, we have also been able to study other types of signs included in Twitter messages. Emojis rapidly appear to be a good sign, a very reliable sign of resistance to climate change mitigation. Among the emojis, you see the second one, so the confused face, that is the most common one associated with this resistance emotion. Almost 10% of tweets containing this emoji do include a difficulty expression towards climate change. We also noted that difficulty expressions are mostly combined with a single emoji, while multiple emojis, so 2 or 3 emojis, do not appear at the same time as a difficulty expression, difficulty word. This might point to the fact that the accumulation of emojis serves the same purpose as a lexical item to convey the idea of resistance. Next slide, please. Let's turn to images, whether they constitute the main message content or whether they're associated to textual content. So you are certainly aware of this famous meme. It is not because a text is associated to an image that it describes this image, or that it repeats the image, or that it completes the image. This is why image analysis is very challenging. You are not at the good slide. Sorry, next slide. Yes, thank you. This is the meme. So this is why image analysis is very challenging when you try to collect a wide visual corpus from social media. Sometimes it completes the text, sometimes it explains the text, but sometimes it mocks the text. So very complicated to be analyzed. Next slide, please. In the framework of our European project I just talked about, we had the opportunity to look into image-based social media as Instagram and YouTube. Publications about climate change considerably differ from one to the other. We have launched a semiotic analysis to start with. In particular, we focused on climate skeptics or climate realistic people who produce content on these media. And we discovered how they played on the codes of the digital image to convince, question, or provoke debate. So the communication strategies used are mainly the scientific ones. They use diagrams, mathematical formula, and charts. And we also found some kind of disturbing simplistic visual. This is the visuals that are often decontextualized or even not related to climate at all, but used for the climate purpose. Next slide, please. This analysis reveals to be even more tricky when the visual content is not at the center of the publication, but goes with a text-based content. This is the case most of the time on Twitter, thanks to our corpus collection that extracts all the content related to a tweet. We can easily retrieve images associated to a textual message. We had use of this content in another project dedicated to the reception of migrants-related tweets among European citizens. And we were able to find out that different kinds of images associated with the same text were more likely to convince a woman, or sometimes a young fellow compared to an older one, and even a Belgian compared to a French citizen. Of course, this research is qualitative, and our aim is to be able to automatically retrieve the image content and even its connotation. Next slide, please. So this perfectly leads to my very rapid conclusions. Next slide, please. So 3 main conclusions. First, there is a need to work more deeply on image-based social media corpora because we have studied so much text-based corpora, social media corpora. There is also a need to make these corpora widely available for the international scientific community, at least. There is also a need to enhance their automatic analysis and to study the regular visual patterns that appear in social media as much as with other kind of archives. This is the aim of a FET-Twin project for which we have applied this year. Together with the State Archives of Belgium. The second challenge I have talked about is to manage social media updates, as we know that internet accounts are closing and opening all the time. Someone else talked about it today. How to achieve this automatically with a higher degree of ethics related to these accounts. And third, I was talking today about linguistics and communication, but I'm highly convinced that these disciplines have to be enriched by others as psychology, sociology, the science of archives, and even the science of earth, sometimes like agronomy, in order to attempt to reach this delicate task of transdisciplinarity. Thank you very much.
We will go to our next speaker, which is Dr. Jamie Mahoney. I hope I pronounce your name right. He is a research fellow in the Northumbria Social Computing Research University in the UK, and his research interests include the use of social media in various contexts, and also the ethical considerations and implications of using this data for research purposes. And Jamie is currently involved in the Perceptions project, and I think this will be also his topic for today. So welcome, Jamie, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for the introduction. Yes, so as has already been mentioned, today I'm going to be talking about our experiences in the Perceptions project, mainly discussing the opportunities and challenges that we've encountered during the project, particularly focusing on the use of social media data within the project. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So just as an overview of what I'm going to talk about today, so I'll give an introduction to the Perceptions project itself, just to provide some broader context to the rest of the presentation. I'll then go on to describe how we use social media data, well, how we planned to use social media data at the outset of the project and how we actually used it during the project. And then following this, I'll then discuss first the challenges that we encountered during the project, and then the opportunities that we benefited from using social media data. And then I'll go on just to highlight quickly a few of the lessons that we learned, and then some outputs and further opportunities and continuing work in the project. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So I guess like the main headline of the project, or the title if you like, is Understanding the Impact of Narratives and Perceptions of Europe on Migration and Providing Practices, Tools and Guides for Practitioners. But essentially the project focuses on understanding narratives and perceptions of Europe and how these might impact migration decisions by individuals. So Perceptions was originally planned and funded as a 36-month project starting back in 2019, and for various reasons it's been extended to 42 months, so it's still ongoing at the moment, including the social media analysis as well, that's currently ongoing. So there's 25 project partners from various countries, and also ranging from frontline practitioners, research institutes such as where I work, as well as SMEs as well. There's a total of 13 countries that we could consider as research sites across 9 different work packages ranging from management through to research, development of digital platforms and dissemination activities as well. So today I'm going to focus on the social media analysis, which forms one of those 9 work packages. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So this sort of summarizes the main aims of the social media work package. So it's to identify what perceptions of Europe are held by potential migrants and how these might be reflected on social and in mainstream media. Also focusing on how these narratives are disseminated and the role that different stakeholders might play in this process as well. And one of the aspects that we also looked at, or one of the partners is looking at, is the role of what was classed as new technologies, so things like bot accounts, and also the impact of misinformation as well. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So now I'm going to discuss how we originally envisaged using social media data in the Perceptions project. So from the outset of the project, we had 2 separate iterations of data collection and analysis planned, formed around 3 main tasks, which were to be separate yet related, and which were to be conducted or at least led by 3 different project partners. So the first of these focuses on the content of social media and mainstream media. The second focuses really on the sort of underlying networks that come into play when this information and these narratives are being formed and shared online. And then the third task relates to the remaining elements that I've already mentioned, such as bot accounts and misinformation. And finally, we set out with a view to using multiple social media platforms as data sources, along with mainstream media. However, if we can move to the next slide, I'll show you how things look a little different now that the project is actually underway. So next slide, please. So as I've mentioned previously, the project has been delayed. So that was the project as a whole, but also work within this particular work package. We still made use of collecting data centrally and then sharing it amongst the different task partners. But what we did have to do for various reasons was to focus on a single social media data platform, namely Twitter. As has been mentioned before, it's widely used, as well as mainstream media data, which we ended up using the GDELT platform for. In the first iteration of tasks, we collected Twitter data based on an extensive list of keywords and phrases related to migration or perceptions of Europe, derived from other elements of the project, and then their translation into various other languages, which resulted in a lot of data. And in the second iteration, to narrow this down, we focused more on what we termed information campaigns. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So this slide just demonstrates very briefly how we made use of this data. So in terms of understanding the content, we used things such as topic modeling, because our data sets were both multilingual, and also we had millions of tweets as well. So there was far too much to be doing any kind of sort of in detail manual analysis. We've also looked at the underlying structures, which we can see in some of the images to the right, and how some of this is segregated sort of by language and also by different types of accounts. And also ongoing research at the moment is looking at the role of or the presence of misinformation in these migration related narratives as well. So if we can move to the next slide, I'm now going to focus on the challenges that we encountered during the project, rather than the ongoing results that we're finding. So next slide, please. So as we're working in quite a sensitive context, one of the main concerns for the project partners, but also the panel of experts and project officer, was preserving the anonymity of people that you might consider participants, mainly, like I said, just due to the very sensitive context that we're working in. These ethical considerations and the legal implications of legislation such as GDPR and the UK equivalent now obviously played a role. One of the main things that we hadn't really considered in any great detail at the start of the project was the implications of different project partners being based in different countries, subject to different legislation, and having different ethical clearance procedures and expectations from their institute and national bodies. So then we had to consider how we could meet the requirements of each of these partners, the wider project consortium, as well as the commission and the project officer, for example. In terms of more practical challenges, we had to consider which social media platforms to focus on. Obviously, different platforms have different user bases and have more or less relevance to the project. But we also had to consider those that we could get ethical clearance to use, and those that had useful means of collecting sufficient amounts of data. Again, relating to data, we had concerns regarding the data collection. We wasn't sure if the data we collected would be relevant to the project's aims. How would we identify this data? Would we collect enough? Would we collect too much? And as is often the case in social media projects, will the access that we currently have to this data source be restricted or even removed entirely during the project? So these are all ongoing challenges that we were encountering. And when you mix all of these challenges together, we have a sort of overarching challenge of balancing the needs to meet the required project outputs, the deliverables and the deadlines, along with pursuing and producing original research contributions and outputs. And these will obviously have different requirements themselves, different timelines and deadlines. So despite these challenges, using social media data in this project also provided a range of opportunities. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So while for ethical reasons, we didn't attempt to identify potential migrants within the data sets that we'd collected, the amount of data that we could collect, which was too much in reflection, and the various contexts that it related to provided enough opportunity to meet the sort of broad goals and aims of the project. So with the availability of the academic Twitter API becoming available during the project, it meant that we could sort of target our data collection and switch from real-time data collection in the first iteration to more targeted historical data collection in the second iteration as well. Also meant that we could expand our analyses, as has been mentioned in previous presentations, from what is often, at least previously, restricted to text analysis techniques, and start to incorporate more analysis of visual content and at larger scales as well. And as I've previously mentioned, so Twitter now makes data available specifically for research purposes, and as more platforms seem to be going in this direction, hopefully there'll be more avenues for research at sort of this kind of scale as well in the future. So if we could move to the next slide, please. Sorry, next slide, please. Thanks. So just talking more generally about the lessons that we learned during the Perceptions project. As I've mentioned, there were issues, well, not issues, but we had interesting discussions between various stakeholders at the beginning. So clarity and agreement between stakeholders such as funding bodies, the project coordinators, all of the different partners involved in the project regarding their own ethical processes and expectations, an understanding of the legal requirements of each of those partners can help things run smoothly. And that's certainly something that we've learned a lot about during the project. Also now speaking as a UK partner that's now operating outside of the EU, GDPR and other data protection requirements for partners inside and outside of the EU can start to make things more complicated, especially when you start talking about things like data transfer. And also, we also benefited from changes to the Twitter API. As I've said, we could switch from real-time data collection to focusing on historical time periods and different contexts. So I think keeping an eye on what might be coming available, but also what might be being removed, is also something that would be useful in future projects. Next slide, please. I'm starting to repeat myself. I've already covered some of this. But yeah, we've learned a lot about implementing different ethical guidelines, the legal requirements of various countries and partners, and finding different approaches that are suitable for project partners and different organizational structures. And while I think in some of the larger projects such as Perceptions, like I said, this has 9 different work packages and social media analysis is only one of them. Sometimes treating the social media analysis as almost a standalone element might seem easier, and probably is to some extent. Integrating, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Integrating that work package within sort of the findings of other elements and being able to contextualize our findings based on the knowledge of other partners and their findings from more traditional sort of face-to-face research techniques has led to much richer understanding of our own findings. So now, if we just move on with this one onto outputs and further opportunities. So as I've said previously, Perceptions is still ongoing, so we're still producing outputs, but we've already published twice on the ethics, both the challenges and how we've dealt with them, which are listed on this slide, and the public project deliverables, and also any upcoming findings are being made available on the Perceptions digital platform. The address is on the slide. And also, we're obviously continuing to publish, or aiming to publish, based on our findings as we go through the remaining few months of the project. Next slide, please. So in terms of ongoing research, we're currently drawing together findings from each of the separate tasks and the 2 iterations to put them into sort of a single set of research outcomes. I'm continuing to focus on a longitudinal analysis of how migration-related narratives and Europe-related narratives have developed over time, and also the role and sharing of visual content in forming and disseminating these narratives as well. And we do have some other contributions that are being made that are also available through the Perceptions platform, and these include policy briefs, again relating to the methods that we've used, the ethical processes we've gone through. And one of the things that we're currently working through is how can and should we share the data sets that we've collected while still operating within the limitations and the restrictions of the project and the ethical approval that we were able to receive from the relevant parties. So with that, I'll say thank you for your attention. And if anybody has any questions, then I'll be happy to attempt to answer them. Thank you.